And so we made it to part 6 of the book, which is called In the Barrel. And so this part, Obama is just getting pummeled constantly, as he puts it, like the daredevils and fools of the old Niagara Falls. You find yourself trapped in the proverbial barrel, tumbling through the crashing water, bruised and disoriented, no longer sure which way is up, powerless to arrest your descent, waiting to hit, so he is powerless to arrest the descent, waiting to hit the bottom and hoping without evidence that you'll survive the impact. So Obama is just totally out of, has no agency in the situation and is just being unfairly maligned by all sides, particularly by the population. And so as he says a couple pages later, across the political spectrum, voters considered the bank bailouts a scam that had allowed the barons of finance to emerge from the crisis relatively unscathed. So the voters are unhappy, and that's seeping into the press, and that's eating into his approval ratings. And so he's just got to sustain this unfair barrage of attacks and insults. And Obama's Treasury Secretary is keen to point out that this isn't true. This is just unfair attacks at the president and at the administration by people who don't understand economics. So he says that Tim Geithner liked to point out that this wasn't strictly true. He would list all the ways Wall Street had paid for their sins. Investment banks had gone belly up. Very few of them had. I think Lehman Brothers was like the only one that had, I mean, maybe a couple other ones did, but most of them got bailed out. CEOs ousted. Okay, again, Lehman Brothers, for instance, the CEO got ousted and then got like $100 million golden parachute.
Another remarkable document is a request submitted to the Compensation Committee of the board on September 11th, 4 days before Lehman filed for bankruptcy. It recommends that the board give 3 departing executives over $20 million in, quote, special payments. In other words, even as Mr. Fold was pleading with Secretary Paulson for a federal rescue, Lehman continued to squander millions on executive compensation.
So this is what Tim Geithner is talking about with Old Testament justice, as he calls it in a little bit. Shares diluted. Oh, so the share prices went down. So there was really some big repercussions before they were immediately bolstered by the quasi-government insurance policy called Too Big to Fail, in which the government steps in to make sure that the biggest corporations continue to do well while small businesses and regular people have no safety net for recessions that are caused by the Wall Street banks. Billions of dollars in losses. And so, they lost billions of their trillions of dollars. They were lost, or hundreds of billions were lost. And so page 529, Obama talks a little bit about the Greek debt crisis, which I understand is an issue that nobody is interested in. So go ahead and skip this. But I kind of am interested in it because I did just read the autobiography of the Greek finance minister for the second half of this crisis, and so I know a little bit about it. And so essentially what happened is there's a global financial crisis caused by Wall Street. Greece is like one of the first countries to go down because there was corruption from previous governments, and then also because they were exploited by European banks, and they're one of the biggest debtor countries. And so essentially, Greece is about to default, which wouldn't be a problem normally for countries, except for most of the debt that they owe to people goes towards other countries' major banks, specifically German banks and also French banks. And so there's a big push to save Greece, because if Greece defaults on its debts, then that could bring down the whole European Union financial system, which is kind of a house of cards to begin with, in the same way that a few percentage of people defaulting on their subprime loans took down the entire house of cards that was built on that, because of all the derivatives and financial instruments that were aggregated together for mortgage-backed securities and the like, which were sold to pensions funds. So essentially, this unstable ground floor, which was the subprime mortgages, led to the collapse of the global economy, in the same way that the Greek default, which is relatively small, maybe like to the tune of, tens or maybe at most hundreds of billions of dollars, would lead to, a much bigger economic collapse throughout Europe, which could have negative repercussions that spiral out of control as more authoritarian, kind of racist, xenophobic leaders, which we've seen in recent years, actually, as Europe continues to disintegrate with Brexit and Marine Le Pen and Orban in Hungary and fascist or right-wing parties gaining power throughout Europe, Poland, Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland. Pretty much Europe is disintegrating, and it's there's kind of been a breakdown east to west and creditor versus debtor countries, and there's the tensions within Europe have been strained significantly by the financial crisis, in the same way that tensions within the U.S. or racist undertones, which might have been papered over in times of growth or times of industrialization, manifested themselves in 2016 after a bunch of trade deals and the hollowing out of industry in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and the Rust Belt, and then that creates the fertile grounds that demagogues can rise. Actually, in Greece itself, right now, like Greece is in like one of the pretty much Greece lost out and they got screwed over by the European Union about 5 years after what Obama talks about in this book. And I think right now, maybe the second biggest party in Greece is called Golden Dawn, which is it's not a neo-Nazi party. It is literally a Nazi party. There's literally a swastika in there. They're Nazis. They're not like Nazis in the sense that Proud Boys are Nazis or that Ben Shapiro's a Nazi. No, there are actually Nazis with a Nazi swastika, and that's continued throughout Europe as pretty much the central powers and what is viewed as like the central kind of established liberalism, kind of the adults in the room, as Yanis Varoufakis puts it, continue to act completely irrationally for the good of Europe, but totally irrationally for their own personal interests, and thereby the interests of the respective German, French banks, and that speeds up the disintegration as nobody's able to look at the systemic problems within Greece or within Europe. And so Obama pretty much says that he was pushing the IMF and the European Central Bank and the creditors and Angela Merkel to make sure that Greece is thrown a lifeline, that they don't default, so that the system doesn't go under with that default. And he says that we don't need to like totally squeeze them to the edge. And he says that once again, this is from the book, once again, our European counterparts had other ideas. As far as the Germans, the Dutch, and many of the other Eurozone members were concerned, the Greeks had brought their troubles on themselves with their shoddy governance and spendthrift ways. Although Merkel assured me that we won't do a Lehman by letting Greece default, both she and her austerity-minded finance minister, Volker Rule, appeared determined to condition any assistance on inadequate penance, despite our warnings that squeezing an already battered Greek economy too hard would be counterproductive. He says the desire to do some of that Old Testament justice and discourage moral hazard was reflected in Europe's initial offer, a loan of $25 billion, barely enough to cover a couple months in Greek debt, blah blah blah. And so then he also says a couple of pages later, to his credit, leaders like Merkel and Sarkozy were too invested in European unity to traffic in such stereotypes, like about like Greeks are just lazy and the French are like this and there's smelly people over here and all the racist stereotypes which are just under the surface. Which the leaders are too high-minded to talk about, but their actions actually inflame and empower these demagogues. But their politics dictated that they proceeded cautiously in agreeing to any rescue plan. I noticed that they rarely mentioned that the German and French banks were some of Greece's biggest lenders, or that much of Greece's accumulated debt had been racked up buying German and French exports, facts that might have made clear to voters why saving Greeks from default amounted to saving their own banks and industries. So Obama, he says it right here. This is the reason that the Germans and the Europeans were sort of squeezing the Greeks so much and destabilizing the whole system and empowering movements like Brexit and all the right-wing demagogues that I talked about, is because they wanted to save their own banks, which is actually the same reason that Obama did the extremely unpopular Wall Street bailouts and didn't prosecute anybody, is because they wanted to say, and so it's almost as if like the banks and the financial institutions and the corporations dictate government policy, and then the politicians have to scramble for alternate rationale as to why they weren't able to do anything that would have helped the actual people. This is politics 101, but what he's saying here is totally true. On the macro scale, like if there is going to be a creditor nation or a nation that produces a surplus, like Germany, there's going to be a debtor nation also, or there's going to be debtor nations like Greece, which need to buy those additional cars, or like right now the U.S. is the debtor nation, and so we'll buy the extra surplus produced in China, and it used to be the other way, so we used to export to the rest of the world. But if we are going to have a global economic, like an integrated global economy, there's always going to be debtor areas and there's going to be creditor areas, and if there's not like a framework that ensures that wealth isn't constantly transferred from the debtors to the creditors in in the system, which is to the benefit of the creditors in places like Germany, then there's going to be shocks to the system. And this is something that the framers of the Bretton Woods understood, but that kind of ended in the mid-1970s with Nixon, and we've had kind of just a muddling through of a really unstable system, which kind of manifests itself in 2008, and the Greek debt crisis was one of the main things. But John Maynard Keynes and other economists understood this, and actually Keynes argued for kind of a system where countries that were creditors would have like not like a tax, but there would be mechanisms by which they have to like transfer wealth back to the debtor countries to ensure that the system as a whole continues to operate like that. This is just one of the many quirks of global capitalism. It doesn't just work like some PragerU video that markets, cure all or whatever it is. There actually has to be decisions made here. And insofar as the decisions are constantly made by bureaucrats and politicians that are trying to benefit their own local banks and thereby the people that bring them to power, then these disintegrative forces manifest themselves, and this is what's happening with Greece. Then Obama starts talking about how high-minded and idealistic and uncorrupted his administration is. So he says, with few exceptions, we avoided the open hostilities and constant leaks that characterized some previous administrations. Without exception, we avoided scandal. I'd made clear at the start of my administration that I'd have zero tolerance for ethical lapses, and people who had a problem with that didn't join us in the first place. And so Obama's like, hey, sorry, like we are going to have the most uncorrupted, angel-like representatives and public servants in my administration that you'd ever seen. And so it's true to a point that like Obama didn't have scandals in the same way that like Bill Clinton had scandals for the things that he did in the Oval Office, or that Trump had scandals with just over-the-top illegal behavior by some people. And so in that sense, Obama, like he followed the rules which were laid out. On the other hand, the entire system's completely corrupt. And so Obama like picked a bunch of people from Wall Street that there's something called a revolving door in Washington. So that means is you'll have a regulator who's in charge of regulating the banks, let's say, that will work in an administration and then immediately get offered a job as a lobbyist in Washington or for the industry that he was supposed to regulate. That happened all the time. Like he's talked about Attorney General Holder, and then he was bending himself into pretzels, saying like all the reasons that they didn't need to prosecute anybody that actually brought down the world economy at the same time as they're throwing tons of people in jail for petty crimes. That guy went on to be a corporate lawyer. First, he came from a corporate law firm. I think it was Covington and Burling, and then he worked in the Obama administration and helped all the corporations and banks and made sure nobody went to jail. And then he went back to that law firm and made millions of dollars. And Obama's like, oh yeah, we had zero ethical lapses. Like this is a top prosecutor in the country, and he's coming from a corporate law firm as he settles deals with companies laundering drugs for the Sinaloa drug cartel, and making sure that their executives don't have any price to pay outside of like stock deferments and fines, which amount to like less than 1 quarter's quarterly profits. So like nothing. This is a type of corruption which is all throughout Washington, but Obama doesn't confront it all. But he pats himself on the back for not having like other types of corruption which aren't as acceptable inside the Beltway. And then the back pattery continues about what a great cabinet that Obama chose. He said, I'd long believed that more perspectives around the table, the better in organizing, the better an organization performed, and I took pride in the fact that we'd recruited the most diverse cabinet in history. Wow, the most diverse cabinet. So what Obama did is he said, do you want to defend Wall Street? Do you want to continue to the wars? Do you want to not attack corporations? Do you support these trade deals? Do you? And he's like, okay, women, black person, LGBT, Indian, blah, 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 white person, blah, blah, blah. And then he got an amalgamation of people that were able to make the same decisions as have always been made, and it was the most diverse in history until the change maker Joe Biden just came into the office, and now he's got an even more diverse cabinet, actually, and he brags about it too. When in reality, they're all they're all acting in the interest of the same constituencies and continuing the system exactly as it was before when it was less diverse. But like this is a token that you can throw out to people and be like, look at Attorney General Eric Holder not do anything in the same way that he did during the Clinton administration. But look, he's a top prosecutor, and I'm black, and I'm the president too. And so we are super not white, old men making the same decisions as all of them as before. Are you happy now? Some people are happy for a little bit, and certainly the corporate media and kind of liberal intelligentsia is happy because that doesn't threaten anything. Like ExxonMobil making the same exact decisions as they've always made with a board of directors that is 40%, female and disproportionately or equally to the proportions within the population, Black, Latino, etc. That doesn't really matter. What matters is, are they still drilling into the ground and causing oil spills and releasing tons of carbon in the air? Is Lockheed Martin still, drone bombing people? One of my favorite tweets, which I saw, was somebody, I think it was Freddie DeBoer or someone, that says, 20 something to the effect of 21st century feminism is, or not feminism, but 21st century politics or something is, making sure that, or liberalism is making sure that, the next panel on how to build a more, deadlier drone has adequate gender diversity. It's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we can do that. Obama's trying to build the most deadly drones, but the people making the decisions are, super diverse. Like, does that make you feel better? People getting blown up by drones, disproportionately, obviously people of color and who are at the brunt of U.S. imperialism. Does that make you feel better that people like you are making these decisions? Obama's going to brag about it here because he has nothing else to brag about in terms of actual substantive change, which was accomplished during his administration, aside from a few things on the margins. And then Obama talks some more about why he wasn't able to do anything with the economy, but he has an interesting sentence here, which is telling. He says, "Finally, we contended with sharp differences within the Democratic Party about both the shape and scope of the reform. For those who lean closer to the political center," that included Tim, Larry, as well as the majority of Democrats in Congress. I don't think that's true. It includes Tim and Larry insofar as the center is what he's calling it, the political center. The political center is not the same as actually the population center. In terms of, Obama already acknowledged, everybody in the world or everybody in the U.S. won an action on Wall Street, and somehow the majority of politicians were able to buck that. Where right now, there's a big push for healthcare reform, and people, I think around 2/3 of people support universal government-run healthcare, i.e. a Medicare for all system, and even the Democratic Party won't even allow that to come to a vote. And so this is not the political, this is supposed to be kind of the left of center party, and they won't even allow what's unbelievably popular by the population to come to a vote. And there's a ton of issues like this. Taxing corporations. The people aren't the ones that want tax breaks for the corporations constantly, but they continue to get it, and it's disproportionately Republicans, but it's something the Democrats push too. Same with trade deals. There's 100 different things like this. It's actually most of the decisions. The war is usually people are tricked into it by the corporations and by the media and by the politicians, but they're not in as much support of it as are the special interest groups. But that's because the political center is not the same as the actual center of what the population wants, and that's because the democratic institutions have been eroded by big money, as well as platitude spewing, rebranded change politicians like Obama, that people don't trust it anymore, and they, regardless of who you vote for, most of the decisions remain the same because those aren't on the agenda, because those would fundamentally take on power, which isn't something that can happen. So in reality, in terms of what people actually want, Larry Summers is on the far right on many issues in terms of austerity and his financial policies and deregulation and the like, and same with Tim Geithner. And so Obama characterized that as the center, which is inaccurate. And so while after explaining all the reasons that a new Glass Steigle was a bad idea, then Obama has another reason why he couldn't do it. And he says, and then there was the politics. We didn't have anything to the votes in the Senate for either reviving Glass Steigle or passing legislation to shrink U.S. banks. So Obama seems to think, well, first of all, he's in opposition to it. So I wonder if being in opposition for the policy, which are you saying now that you'd want to do, but you just don't have the votes for it, or is this just another excuse? I'm sitting here, we just had a thing with the 2000, people, we might be able to get $2,000 checks, despite it looking like a couple weeks ago there was going to be zero direct payments, and then Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley pushed to try to get $1,200 direct payments, and then they ended up getting $600 direct payments and continued to push, and then Trump came in and it was like, we need to do this. And then the Republicans, who don't want to give anything to anybody outside of a couple of them like Josh Hawley, now might actually have to do it because of the political pressure of what would happen if they stand in opposition to their own president. And so now it looks like we might be able to get $2,000, even though Mitch McConnell is probably still going to block it, which isn't actually good for his political future. And the reason for that is because when a president or when politicians actually push for things that are unbelievably popular, like a Glass Steagall or taking on the banks, you can get the votes. The votes, like, it's not a zero sum game. Like, it's not a static thing that can't be changed and is just like okay, once we get this senator, he's not accountable to his people, and so there's nothing that can be done to change the votes. This is an issue where you could have gotten the votes, and you were supposed to be the progressive president taking them on, but you didn't want to. So in this last page, you explain all the reasons you don't want to, and on this page, you say we don't have the votes for the thing that you don't want to do anyways. Page 548, Obama kind of continues his pattern of taking both sides of every issue rhetorically, while at the same time, on the substance, always siding with the establishment. So here he's throwing a bone to the left when he talks about financial reforms and what he wants to do, and he says that I had some sympathy for the left's indictment of the status quo. Rather than effectively allocate capital to productive uses, Wall Street really did increasingly function like a trillion-dollar casino. Its outsized profits and compensation packages overly dependent on ever greater leverage and speculation. Okay, yes, that's true. Wall Street is super leveraged at the moment as well, and if any of the too big to fail banks failed, they would still go under. I mean, they might be there was slight reforms in terms of not being able to leverage in the same way that they were in 2006, 2007 that were passed in Dodd Frank, but it wasn't systemically altered. Its obsession with quarterly earnings had warped corporate decision making and encouraged short-term thinking. So Obama phrases that as like an obsession, as if there's some, pathological people or people that have just gone off the rails a little bit, and now they're too obsessed, and they've taken over all of Wall Street and all of corporate America. Now, what actually happened is that there are things called corporate charters that legally mandate that corporations need to maximize profits for their shareholders. So that means they need to make as much money as possible each quarter, and if, for some reason a CEO did start to think more about, the impact of their short-term profit-making had on the rest of the world, they would immediately be thrown out because they are actually violating the law or what their obligation is to their shareholders. So they'd be immediately gone and put in with somebody else. So the system is a problem, and the individuals just accommodate that that are doing bad things, accommodate themselves to that system. But Obama can't take on the system because he can't fundamentally change anything because he wants to be embraced by it, and so he has to frame it as if it's individuals and then not do anything about even the individuals. Untethered to place, indifferent to the impacts of globalization on particular workers and communities, the financial markets had helped accelerate the offshoring of jobs and the concentration of wealth in a handful of cities and economic sectors, leaving huge swaths of the country drained of money, talent, and hope. Again, he phrases it as if, they've just lost their way, these corporations. I need to have a talk with them and tell them, even though you're not going to make as much money in the short term, and this is written into your charter that you need to make as much money as you can, and that's the only reason that you're here, why don't you just keep your factory in Detroit, paying these people $20 an hour, and not take advantage of these trade deals, which I've supported and haven't done anything to reform, the ones that were implemented before my term in office, and don't move your production to Mexico, where you have to pay much less in terms of labor and environmental standards and costs. This is the only way that Obama can phrase it. But again, globalization, Obama is kind of one of the chief cheerleaders of in the 2010s, and the principal rebrander of. But the way he's able to do it is he's able to throw little carrots to the left like this in paragraph 1 of page 548, where he says, I don't like this, and then goes on to explain why he couldn't do anything about it if he's not outright gaslighting you about the things that he did do to make you think that he did do something when he actually didn't do anything at all. And then he says what he wants to do. He says big, bold policies could make a dent in these problems, most of which had to do with rewriting the tax code, strengthening labor laws, and changing the rules of corporate governments. All three items were high on my to-do list. Aren't you happy that these items were high on his to-do list? Too bad he never got to them in 8 years. Big, bold policy. I follow this all the time. Rewriting the tax code. Did Obama rewrite the tax code? No, Obama, the one thing he did is he partially extended the Bush tax cuts. And so they didn't apply to everybody. The richest people didn't have their tax cuts extended in every aspect. But he didn't do anything to reform the tax code. He actually was advocating for reducing the corporate tax rate by the end of his term. He didn't do anything to reform the tax code. Strengthening labor laws, what labor laws did Obama pass? The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which applies to hardly anybody. I mean, that's a good thing, but that's not the problem with the economy and the outsourcing that he's talking about. Tom Perez was his labor secretary. He's a total sellout who he tried to tinker a little bit on the edges. I know he did stuff with federal contractors and this and that. There was a couple things that Obama did which was better than what McCain or Romney would have done, but he didn't do anything fundamentally to change. Like he wasn't a New Dealer, or he didn't do things like Roosevelt or even Truman were advocating with labor laws and changing the rules of corporate government. What did he? Is the rules of corporate governments different now than they were in 2007? Like the rules are exactly the same. The short-term profit making, which he was talking about the previous pair, that's still absolutely there for everybody, and the corporations are bigger than before and have more power than before, and one of the reasons is because you didn't do anything about it, and you put them in your administration, and you didn't prosecute them, and you made sure to bail them out, et cetera, et cetera. All three were high on my to-do list. He didn't do anything. He just says that so you can get to the next paragraph, which says, but when it came to regulating the financial markets to make the system more stable, the left's prescription missed the mark. And so then he's going to go on to, tell us why. He's like, listen, these are high on my to-do list, but this main thing, I'm going to tell you why I can't. He's got to play both sides. So he has to, here's a bone for you. It's really nonsense. It's just bone marrow and rot. And here's the rest of the hog for the Wall Street. And I'm going to explain to you why we can't do anything fundamentally. The evidence didn't show that limiting the size of U.S. banks would have prevented the recent crisis or the need for federal interventions once the system had begun to unravel. Okay, so he's like, even though these banks were too big to fail, the evidence didn't show that limiting the size of the banks would have done anything. And so, if they were small, I mean, what is he talking about? There was a bunch of businesses that went under during the financial crisis, including presumably credit unions and other small lenders, which are allowed to go under. But the ones that were bailed out were big. Now his argument is going to be that they weren't too big because even the medium-sized ones were too big. That's a stronger argument for too big to fail. I'll go ahead and read what he says. He says, J.P. Morgan's assets dwarf those of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, but it was those smaller firms' highly leveraged bets on securitized subprime mortgages that had set off a panic. So he's like, look, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers were too big to fail, and there's no way I'm going to do anything about them being too big because that would mean I have to take on a bunch of special interests and not just break up like the major 5 financial institutions, but maybe break up 20. And so like that's totally off the agenda. And because that size, like we're never going to do anything about. This is just saying that like the system is so unstable that even a medium-sized firm can bring down the entire economy because of how intertwined it is with the rest of the economy. This isn't an argument against Glass Steigle like he's phrasing it as. It's an argument of like, listen, I'm not going to try to do too much, and it's even worse than you think. And so like we couldn't really solve it by like doing a little bit that I might have considered doing. But he's just rephrasing it. The last major U.S. financial crisis, he says, but it was those smaller firms that set off the panic. The last major U.S. financial crisis back in the 1980s hadn't involved big banks at all. Instead, the system had been rocked by a deluge of high-risk loans and thousands of small, poorly capitalized regional savings and loans associations in cities and towns across the country. Well, that's interesting. I think the savings and loans crisis was it in the end of the Reagan administration or the beginning of the first Bush administration? But yeah, no, that's true. It was a different crisis. But what's interesting about that crisis is hundreds of people went to prison for that smaller crisis. So the Republican administration, if I remember correctly, I want to say it was the first Bush administration. It says in the 1980s. Maybe it was the Reagan administration. Threw hundreds of people into prison for taking down the economy to a much lesser extent. And Obama's using that. Now he's using it as an excuse not to take on the major banks. But really, it's an indictment of the Holder Memorandum, which was passed by Eric Holder when he was in the Clinton administration, and then implemented at its crux in the Obama administration, which said we can't prosecute anybody in any major financial institution because that might affect their share prices, and we don't want to hurt that. And so Obama, he brings up the savings and loan crisis in order to cover his butt in this instance for not taking action. But in reality, the Republican administrations were able to throw hundreds of people into prison and prosecute them for this much smaller fraud when Obama wasn't able to do anything for a much larger fraud. And it was its explicit policy not to do anything, the Holder Justice Department. Given this, which again went right back to Wall Street after he came from Wall Street, he worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, I believe, which is a corporate law firm. He worked for the Clinton administration, came up with an idea that we can't prosecute any major bank, executives in banks, or that we shouldn't because there could be systemic risks, and then went back to work at a corporate law firm, and then worked for Obama, where he made sure not to prosecute anybody, and then got millions of dollars to go back to those corporate law firms. And Obama's like, I don't understand why I'm in the barrel, constantly being attacked. Again, that's the name of this part of the book, is he's just constantly being attacked unfairly. He says, given the scope of their operations, we thought it made sense for regulators to give banks like Citi or Bank of America extra scrutiny, but cutting their assets in half wouldn't change that. The fact that they would still be a risk to the system with only half their assets. Actually, that's a bigger indictment of the system, and a stronger argument for taking strong action against these giant banks, that they're so big that even half of them would still be a systemic risk. Well, Obama's presupposition to all of this is he's like, that was unthinkable to cut in half, and doing more than that is just totally off the table. And he says, and since the banking sectors of most European and Asian countries were actually more concentrated than they were here, limiting the size of U.S. banks would put them at a big disadvantage in the international marketplace, all without eliminating the overall risk in the system. Okay, this is the real reason that Obama doesn't want to take action against the banks, because that would not be good for the banks, essentially, is what he's like. He's like, this globalization that the banks have been pushing for has caused an even bigger concentration in Asia and Europe. I think it's actually probably untrue that the biggest banks in Asia and Europe are bigger than the ones in the U.S. It might be true that they're more concentrated there, but the U.S. has a bigger economy, so I think that this is probably misleading without looking into it too much. But either way, even if Deutsche Bank is slightly bigger than Bank of America, the fact remains that a very small number of banks, probably 10 or so, control most of the assets within the global economy. And Obama cannot take those on. That would be too much of a heavy lift. Teddy Roosevelt was known as the trust buster in the early 1900s, who was a Republican, and he broke up a bunch of the monopolies of that time run by the most powerful people, like Standard Oil, and he took on all of the oil, not oil barons, but robber barons that had a stranglehold on the economy, and he was a Republican. Now we have a change president who's a Democrat that was elected, and he knows that he has all the people on his side, and he's just going out of his way not to do anything. So then Obama starts, bragging about all the good things that were in the Dodd and Frank financial reform bill, which there were some good things in the bill. It did partially regulate derivatives, which used to be completely unregulated and now are partially unregulated. And derivatives were one of the main reasons that when the subprime mortgages went down, it didn't just bring down the mortgage-backed securities, but it took down the entire financial institutions, is that the derivatives were pretty much betting on everything and connecting everything to one another. And so when one thing went down, brought the whole economy with it. So that's good. He talks about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau being passed, which he kind of takes credit for, which he shouldn't take credit for. It was Elizabeth Warren's idea, and she was the one that was pushing it. He even acknowledges here that Tim Geithner and Larry Summers were fighting against it the whole time. So his administration was against it. He was personally kind of agnostic to it, and Elizabeth Warren eventually got it through. Back when she was actually fighting for regular people, and before she was staying in the presidential race extra long and taking, I think, $10 million from a super PAC that she said she would never take money from a super PAC, and then it looks like she's about to lose. Then she takes $10 million from a super PAC to stay in through Super Tuesday to make sure that Joe Biden wins the presidency, who she'd previously called the senator from MDNA, I believe, which is one of the major credit card companies. So she got into politics fighting the credit card companies, was an actual financial reformer, and she recognized that Joe Biden was her principal opposition. And by the end of it, she's so narcissistic, egotistical, and part of the system that she is taking money she said she wouldn't have taken a month earlier just to stay in a race that she has no hopes of winning at all, and gets third place in her own state, just so that she can take enough votes from Bernie Sanders to make sure that Joe Biden is elected on Super Tuesday. When Obama himself goes out of his way to call up Pete Buttigieg and presumably Beto O'Rourke and Amy Klobuchar and put pressure on all the establishment Democrats the day before Super Tuesday to make sure that they all drop out and endorse Joe Biden, who had gotten it smoked in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, and it was totally dead on the campaign trail before Clyburn endorsed him, but still was about to get clobbered in Super Tuesday by Sanders. And the one thing that Obama, that apparently Elizabeth Warren too, who's turned to the dark side, and all the establishment hate, is somebody that actually was going to institute institute change, because Obama wants to get credit for being the idealist here, but also get credit from the establishment for looking after and catering to their interests all the time. And so when an old socialist grandpa Bernie Sanders come along and he has more credibility and does more things against the fat cat Wall Streeters that Obama says that he wants to take action against, but doesn't do anything about, that threatens Obama's legacy. And so he pulls out all the stops to make sure that actual change is undermined. And so Obama is turned from somebody that got elected by millions of young people hoping for hope and change to somebody that is going out of his way to put all the stops in to make sure that an actual reformer who would have got people real health care reform rather than just corporate giveaways to the health insurance, pharmaceutical, and other industries, which Obama says right in the book, which I've talked about, he went out of the way not to take on. He's like, we can't take on any special interests, so instead we're going to adopt the Republicans' Heritage Foundation plans and Mitt Romney's plans for health care reform, and we're going to make that our plan, and we're going to hopefully tinker around the edges a little bit. And that's going to be our reform. Bernie Sanders is like, we're going to get everybody health care and we're going to take on these special interests. Obama doesn't like that because he wants to be viewed as somebody that tried his best and is a super idealist and wanted to help people, and not somebody that sold out and gave away all of his values to these special interests, which he's now catering to in a number of different ways. And what Warren did was particularly despicable also, but it's true that she did help get this one good thing in the Dodd-Frank bill. However, the bill that Obama's bragging about here, Dodd-Frank, which is named after Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, do you know what those two people did? The reformers of the banks did right after they did this reform, is they went and they joined board of directors, or as executives for banks. So they went and they joined the board of directors for the banks, which they were supposed to be taking on and reforming. This is the type of corruption that Obama says there's a scandal-free and totally uncorrupt administration. This is a type of revolving door corruption that happens all the time, which Obama's not going to take on at all. Because again, Obama gave speeches to Wall Street right after this. He is praised by them all the time, and he catered to them, and he got donations from them for both of his campaigns, and he played politics well. But that's not corruption. This is not corruption. So when Dodd and Frank both cater to the banks, especially Dodd, who's unbelievably corrupt, and then go join those banks and are praised by them right afterwards, that's fine to Obama. He's not going to comment on that at all. He's going to brag about how much he changed the system. Do you think that if you change the system that much, they would be paying the people that changed the system for you? I mean, one thing that Obama says is that it's extremely complex. He says the bulk of these proposals were highly technical, involving aspects of the financial system that were hidden from the public view. That's really true, and I try to look into it as much as I can, but it's a lot of confusing stuff, and unless you're really in deep and you understand the technicalities of all the different financial instruments and tinkering arounds of the 1,000-page long bills, which are written in jargon, it's hard to know everything. But insofar as you do look into it, the more that I look into it, or the more that you listen to people that actually know what they're talking about, that aren't serving on bank boards, after they pass this legislation, the more clear it is how corrupt the entire system is, because those people that actually understand it are shouting from the rooftops, this is insane. Dodd, I know at one point was going out of the way. He had promised he was going out of the way to come back in and put in amendments that would undermine his own regulation, the Volker Rule, which I'm about to talk about. He says that one issue that did capture headlines involved a proposal by former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker to prohibit FDIC-insured banks. Just quick aside, FDIC-insured banks, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation banks, that's if the bank goes under, you're still insured, I think, up to $100,000 per depositor. This is another way that the government subsidizes banks, and so this is a insurance policy paid for by the taxpayers to prop up banks, which I think is a good thing. You don't want these banks going under and then everybody loses all of their money. However, at the same time, let's not pretend when you're talking about China a few pages back that China is the one that subsidizes their corporation. We do it a million ways. We do it through tax cuts. We do it through this. We do it through government spending and military spending. We do it through not holding their executives into account. There's 100 ways which they're subsidized, but again, Obama won't acknowledge that there. But he says Paul Volcker wanted them to prohibit FDIC-insured banks from trading on their own accounts or operating their own hedge funds and private equity shops. According to Volcker, this short provision offered a simple way to restore some of the prudential boundaries that Glass Steigle had placed around commercial banks. Yeah, no, pretty much everybody agreed. And it was pretty simple. And then Obama actually describes here what Tim Geithner and Larry Summers thought about it. Tim and Larry, the top people Obama put in the administration, thought they were skeptical, arguing that it would be difficult to administer and might impinge on legitimate services the banks provide to their customers. To me, their positions sounded flimsy. One of the few times during our work that I felt they harbored more sympathy for the financial industry's perspective than the facts warranted. This is one of the few times that my Wall Street ghouls that I put into office to cater to every single special interest under the sun, catered to those interests. So he's acknowledging it here. He's like, I'm going to fight for it anyways, even if you think it's a bad idea. And Tim Geithner finally relents and he says, if it helps us get the bill passed, Tim said, we can find a way to make it work. And so he's just like, for Tim, it was a rare concession to political optics. And so for Tim, it's like, this is just, something that we're just throwing out there just to make it look like we're doing something. But in reality, like, this is a bad idea. In reality, most of the stuff they did was stuff they threw out to make it look like they were doing something that didn't do anything. This was something that actually would do something, and that's the reason that Tim Geithner was opposed to it. And what actually happened with the Volker Rule is that it was put in there, and then it was constantly undermined to the point that, like, there's loophole after loophole after loophole, like on page 342, page 387, like just deep in the bill that are thrown in there that it's like, okay, you only need to be capitalized by 3.5% of this if you have this, but there's an exemption for that. And I don't understand all of it because you can't, it's a full-time job to follow all of this. But when you read people that actually do follow it, they're like, oh yeah, no, this is Volcker Rule is totally watered down and means nothing. And one thing that actually happened was Chris Dodd, who's the head of the bill, like went out of the way to like try to insert amendments that would undermine this rule, which he was nominally in favor for. So what they want is they want the credit of doing something without doing anything at all. That's the best of both worlds, and that's what Obama's trying to put here. But there was, I read that at one point there was literally like the actual progressives in Congress or in the Senate would actually like stand guard like in the chamber to make sure that Chris Dodd wouldn't come in the middle of the night to insert an amendment to undermine his own rule. That's how corrupt these people are, and they end up undermining it. Chuck Schumer went out of the way, who's the Senate Majority Leader now, who's like represents all the big banks in New York, went out of the way to try to get it watered down. And these are things that like aren't talked about in the same way that Trump tweets are today, because like it takes it, like I said, it's a full-time job to follow all of this, but at the end of the day, you get a bill which has the Volcker Rule in it, which doesn't really affect the banks at all, and then you have politicians bragging about how much things are changed, and then when the economy crashes in a couple of years from the same type of systemic risk that happened previously, people will lose even more faith in their public officials because they've been lied to by Obama and by his administration about the Volcker Rule and a million other things like that, which were really just surface-level nothings. Most of Chapter 23 is going to talk about the BP oil spill off the Gulf, and Obama's going to like go through a bunch of reasons why he was unfairly attacked from that. And he says, I knew that the explosion would have serious implications for our agenda. A few weeks earlier, I had authorized the Department of Interior to allow for the sale of certain offshore leases, which would open up oil exploration. And so Obama's like, yes, I allowed this. But he's going to go on to say, like, it's like, even though my we hadn't had enough time to redo the rules around the safety procedures, which led to the explosion, which led to the gigantic oil spill, and so I was blamed for that, even though I shouldn't have been, which he goes on to say later on. But again, he's like, oh yeah, no, I just opened up oil exploration. This is like the climate. He says earlier in the book how unfair it is that he's like not getting credit for climate change stuff. Like I said, if you're opening up all the exploration of offshore oil drilling and fracking and making pipelines around the world that you're bragging about, you don't get credit for doing climate change stuff, but he wants credit for that, and then he also doesn't want to be blamed for when his agenda, our energy agenda, leads to gigantic oil spills in the Gulf. Wow, I forgot this was here, but a paragraph later, Obama says, above all, he's saying why he decided to let them drill off the coast, my decision to allow new exploratory drilling was a last-ditch effort to salvage our climate change legislation. So he allowed drilling off the Gulf Coast in order to salvage climate change legislation, which by then was on life support. The previous fall, when GOP Senator Lindsey Graham had agreed to put together a bipartisan climate bill, he'd warned that we'd have to give up something in order to win enough Republicans. So Obama is like, okay, I need to work with Lindsey Graham, who, if you're alive today, he's completely insane in the pockets of every special interest and a total Trumper. And this is the guy that Obama was trying to work with to get a climate change bill passed, rather than mobilize the giant coalition that he had amalgamated of people hoping for change, principally environment. Obama was supported by environmentalists. He wasn't supported by offshore oil drilling supporters, but he goes out of his way to discard the environmentalists to work with the people who want fracking and offshore oil drilling and the like in order to try to get Lindsey Graham. And surprise, surprise, he didn't get Lindsey Graham support or any Republican support, and instead gave away the House for hardly doing anything, and then had oil spills like this, which he doesn't want to take any responsibility for either, because it wasn't his fault. So a little bit later, they finally get the BP well to stop leaking, and Obama's like, okay, I need to, show to the public things are okay. He says a picture from that trip, he takes like a little vacation near the Gulf or something, taken by Peter Sousa and released later by the White House, shows that me and Sasha splashing in water, a signal to Americans that it was safe to swim in the Gulf. And so Obama, if you know anything about Obama, he loves pictures of water to signify to Americans that everything's fine, even when the water is poisoned. Here's a picture, which I won't talk about too much, of poisonous water that is actually not the water in Flint, Michigan that he was trying to tell other people to drink, which is still unsafe to drink, which he just flew in, drank the water, and it wasn't really solved, and it's kind of the same thing with the Gulf. Obama is great at the optics. So page 583, Obama feels like he needs to defend his counterterrorism record against Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney is criticizing him for not being hawkish enough against terrorists, and Obama's like, listen, like I've done plenty of stuff. He says that Cheney's assertion that my administration wasn't treating Al-Qaeda as a military threat was hard to square with the additional battalions I'd deploy in Afghanistan. So he's like, I'm more hawkish than you were in Afghanistan, Dick Cheney, and I won a Nobel Peace Prize doing it. Or the scores of Al-Qaeda operatives we were targeting with drone strikes, and I expanded the drone program. So take that, Dick Cheney. So this is like one of two places in the book Obama talks about drone programs, which is similar to his administration in that he never, or he very rarely discussed like his drone programs at all. He'd make jokes about like Predator drones blowing up the Jonas Brothers at White House Correspondents' dinners.
The Jonas Brothers are here. They're out there somewhere. Sasha and Malia are huge fans, but boys don't get any ideas. I have two words for you: Predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?
But the actual legal rationale and scaffolding and protocols for the drone program were almost never discussed by the Obama administration because the press corps pretty much never asked him about it. In fact, the biggest question I ever saw, most direct question I ever saw Obama answer was in like a Google Hangout with some kids, and one of the kids, like just on a whim, asked him about it, something that all of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN wasn't able to think of, and that's because they've accommodated themselves to the system, and so for them, antagonistic journalism means badgering Trump about politically incorrect tweets, or if it's Obama, maybe complaining about his beige suit. But in terms of like American militarism, we're not going to really question that too much because that's the knife that butters our bread as well. And so that's just how it goes. And so if we had an actual adversarial press that was actually interested in holding people in power into account rather than kind of licking the boots of Obama and the Democratic Party and the establishment and the military-industrial complex, and then just kind of focusing on like TMZ level, like surface level nothings and riling up your side in that way while all the major important decisions are agreed upon and therefore not scrutinized by the press. If we had that, then they would be asking him about a number of things with the drone program. Like there was a leak during the second half of the Obama administration. It's called the drone papers to The Intercept, which showed that during a 6-month period, 88%, I believe, of all the people that were killed in drone strikes were not the intended targets. And so like 9 out of 10 people almost that are being blown up are not the people that we actually, try to blow up. Like imagine if that was happening in the US, that Russia or Germany or China or whoever it was saw that there was like, these guys are, these are threats to China or whatever it is. And so they just blow them up extrajudiciously without comment. And then 9 other people are killed around them. Would that cause the US or people within the US to not view China or Afghanistan or whatever country was doing that very well and maybe inflame terrorism and extremism against that country? Yes, that's exactly what it is. And so Obama's bragging here to Dick Cheney that he's being extra hawkish is actually kind of like an acknowledgement, if you actually think about it, that Obama is accelerating the Cheney program as well as radicalizing the very terrorists that he claims to be undermining, which is why like the Middle East is not, are we more secure now than we were in 2002? Like, There was no ISIS before. All of Syria is fractured. Afghanistan is the same exact thing with the Taliban controlling almost the exact same amount of land as 20 years ago. Iraq is still a quagmire. The whole Middle East is smashed to bits, largely because of the invasion of Iraq, but also because of policies like this which aren't scrutinized by the press. And so 88% civilians are killed. And it's actually the policy of the Pentagon, of the military, to count every military-aged male in a drone strike as a terrorist. And so, despite that, there's still tons of civilian casualties, but they're counting people that they don't even know the identities of as a terrorist just because they were in the proximity and therefore killed as collateral damage of people that they also still don't know are terrorists but think might be terrorists. Like a lot of the terrorists, they don't even know the names of. They just have the cell phone records of. This was also, I think, an Intercept story that they would just blow up people based on their cell phones, and that's how they got the data for it, and then as well as tons of people around him. And so this is the Obama administration's drone program. And there's no scrutiny for it. He'd also do it with American citizens. So Anwar al-Awlaki was a Muslim cleric who kind of became radicalized and then would give speeches on YouTube, which other people would listen to, and they'd become anti-American. And Obama just decided at one of his Terror Tuesday meetings, we're going to need to blow up this guy as well. And there was no comment from it. It's like, is that a good precedent? Like, there are lots of bad people out there. There are murderers. There are rapists. There are thieves. There are lots of bad people out there. Is it a good thing that a President Trump or a President Palin now has a precedent that you can just go out and drone bomb an American citizen without a trial? Like, is that a good thing? I mean, you could argue, okay, he's a bad person, but then that would also be an argument for torture, which Obama decided not to prosecute the torturers, but did say we shouldn't be torturing people. Well, why shouldn't we be torturing them? They're terrorists. Or why should they get trials or go not be held in a Guantanamo Bay for 20 years? They're terrorists. The reason is because, like, you're supposed to be better than the terrorists, and you're supposed to have things called civil liberties and the rule of law, which dictates what happens in a civilized society, unlike the terrorists. But instead, Obama is acting as a terrorist president and blowing up people from the sky without comment while receiving his Nobel Peace Prize. And actually, coincidentally, Malala Yousafzai, when she visited the White House, mentioned this to Obama, that, hey, like, all these people in Pakistan, they're not very happy that you keep blowing all of them up with your drones. And Obama's like, I don't really want to hear it, little girl. This is for the photo shoot. But it's absolutely true. Like, you can't just blow people up and expect. And so, blowing up tons of people that are collateral damage, doesn't even know the names of people that he's blown up, just has their cell phone numbers, radicalizing other ones, bragging to Dick Cheney that it's, that's just how it goes. And then also doing it to American citizens, including the son of Anwar al-Awlaki. And so, like, a couple weeks or months after he killed al-Awlaki, he killed his son also, whose name was Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was like a 10-year-old kid who was not radicalized at all. And he just blew him up, and the Obama administration didn't comment on it at all, except for to say, well, I guess he shouldn't have had such a bad dad, as if you can intergenerational guilt, you just blow up other Americans. And then Trump actually, during his term, blew up his sister also, who was like an 8-year-old girl or something else, as well. And this is the Obama administration, and this is all Obama has to say in a 700-page book about the whole drone program. He's mentioned it like in a couple of sentences, and it says a lot about the media and about U.S. political culture that something like this no comment at all. Imagine, like, I'm sitting here under the sky. Sometimes there's like crows flying above my head and things, or the wind comes, or I hear a deer and I'm kind of scared. Imagine if, like, you're living in Yemen or Pakistan or Afghanistan or Somalia or Syria or Iraq or and there's one more. There was 7 countries that Obama was drone bombing, and it's just a regular thing that just up above, like, at any moment they could drone bomb your wedding. I think Obama drone bombed like 5 weddings or so, as well. A bunch of, like, they don't really know. There's a certain level of collateral damage, which is pretty high when 88% at least of the people that are killed are civilians. That is just okay. And so he's drone bombing weddings, he's drone bombing here, he's drone bombing there, and then also that has like a chilling effect. Like, imagine, like, anytime you go to the park, maybe Afghanistan drones would bomb you from the sky and blow up everybody that around you. That's not a good thing for reducing terrorism racism or anxiety within those countries. And Obama has nothing to say about it, despite being the peace-loving humanitarian idealist that he tries to paint himself as. He's a total fraud, and this is one of the biggest examples that he like can't even figure out how to mention it, but is able to talk for pages and pages about how great Larry Summers and Tim Geithner are. And so now, page 585, Obama needs to give Eric Holder his obligatory page-long mini biography about his idealistic public service career and his upbringing. So he says, I could see why. So Eric was, tall and even-tempered. He'd grown up in Queens, New York, son of middle-class parents, attended my alma mater a decade before I got there. He played basketball, and he'd been to sit-ins, and in law school, he'd be interested in civil rights, and he was with the NAACP. And like me, he'd chosen public service rather than a job in a corporate law firm. He's like, wow, what an idealist. So he's like, look at this public servant. Look at me, the public servant idealist that's the president, and here's my attorney general, who's also, totally interested in just helping people and not interested in power at all. This is my administration. This is the picture Obama's trying to paint. Again, Eric Holder's career was start in the government, then eventually make it up to the Clinton administration, and then go join a corporate law firm. I think it was Covington and Burling, like I mentioned. Work there, make millions of dollars, go back to the government, work as attorney general for Obama, get praised in long dialogues like this about your public service and how you didn't work in corporate law firms, and then go back and work in a corporate law firm making millions of dollars after you just shielded those same people and those same classes against the repercussions of their crimes while you were attorney general by making sure that nobody went to prison for anything. That was except for poor people. So only the rich people were to go there. It's not a bad deal for Eric Holder, but really dishonest by Obama. But again, people don't know the biographies of his attorney general. And so 9 out of 10 people will be like, oh, wow, I didn't know about that about Eric. He played basketball and worked for the NAACP, and he participated in sit-ins. Like, wow. All right, so the next chapter, Obama just lost big in the midterm elections, and so he's reflecting on why that is. And of course he has to see it as, I tried to do too much, and this, I was too idealistic, and that came back to bite me in the butt. When in reality, like, you were idealistic in 2008 to a much greater extent, and then you went ahead and put all the Clinton administration and Bush administration people within your administration while protecting Wall Street and continuing the exact same role for the corrupt government and the establishment as before, thereby losing support from the population who thought you were going to actually change something, and then lost in the midterms. But he can't say that, so he has to say, I try to do too much, and he has to phrase it as like, I'm not sorry for trying to do too much. And so that's what this is. He says, the truth was, I didn't regret paving the way for 20 million people to get health insurance. So that's what he did with Obamacare. He didn't work with the insurance companies, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, the private healthcare industry to make sure their profits increase, and said that explicitly, anything that would take them on is not going to be in my bill. And so now we have a continuation of the most inefficient system in the world, which doesn't get that many people that excited. He's talking about the individual mandate, which was like the least popular part of his insurance plan, but it did increase the number of people who were insured. He's like, okay, yeah, this is a great hope and change within a private system which is totally corrupt and leaves a ton of people underinsured, uninsured, with medical debts, bankrupt. This is the system. Nor did I regret the Recovery Act. The hard evidence showed the austerity in response to recession would have been disastrous. Again, he's like, okay, I didn't regret the Recovery Act. I think the Recovery Act was good, but it was $800 billion. I'm sitting here right now, and Trump, just through like one little video conference, is about to get $2,000 to each American, or almost got $2,000 to each American, in what would be the second $2-ish trillion bill, or $1.5 trillion, after another $2 trillion bill at the start of the pandemic. And that's from a Republican. And it's like, during times of crisis, you can actually get things if you push for it, because the population wants relief. So Trump would have, just in the last year, gotten 4 times the amount Obama was talking about in the Recovery Act. But Obama needs to phrase it as, I tried to do too much. And again, the Recovery Act had things in it like high-speed rail, which never even happened. And like a lot of it was giveaways to big corporations, which did stimulate the economy, but it doesn't get people that excited to vote for you in 2010. I didn't regret how he'd handled the financial crisis, given the choices we faced. Although he puts in parentheses, this is the one bone that you're going to get. That's actually true. Although I did regret not coming up with a better plan to help stem the tides of foreclosures. I talked about this earlier, but the cram down, the bill that was being pushed and had enough support in Congress to actually stop the foreclosures and make sure that all these people weren't going underwater, you've already criticized that idea like twice previously, and it was your administration Larry Summers and Tim Geithner that went out of the way to lobby against it. They weren't even agnostic to it, in which case Congress would have passed it. They actually stopped it. And so he's like, I didn't come up with the idea. Actually, you blocked the idea, and it was a disaster. And so you give it one half a sentence on page 594 of your book to acknowledge that, while painting yourself as the, as the president that tried too hard to help people, and that's why you lost. And I sure as hell wasn't sorry that I'd proposed a climate change bill and pushed for immigration reform. I proposed a climate change bill, which I, while also doing an all-of-the-above energy strategy, expanding fracking, offshore drilling, pipelines, clean coal, and trying to get I was trying to, propose a climate change bill with Lindsey Graham. I'm not gonna apologize for it. This is why you didn't get anything. This is why I didn't get anything passed, and then your base doesn't have support for you anymore to win the midterms. Is that your administration is being co-opted by Lindsey Graham. And then he says, as far as I was concerned, the election didn't prove that our agenda had been wrong. It just proved that, whether for lack of talent, cunning, charm, or good fortune, I'd failed to rally the nation, as FDR had once done, behind what I knew to be right. This is totally on an FDR rallied the nation because he actually did stuff. He actually got major reforms passed. He didn't immediately pack his administration with robber barons and the establishment that has taken down the economy in 1929 and the Hoover administration. This is what Obama did. He just put in the exact same people, and now he wants to say the reason I didn't isn't because I wasn't as talented or cunning or charming as FDR. FDR wasn't that cunning or charming. He just knew how to mobilize people and mobilize his base for actual policies that were reformist, rather than not doing any of that and then losing his base and then saying that he tried too hard and wasn't cunning enough. I feel like Obama's really smart. I would like to think he has to know this, but there also is a certain amount of willful ignorance or ignorance that you have to internalize if you are still going to view yourself as a good person and believe the crap that you're putting down here for the public to digest. That would say that this is the reason, because the alternative is probably too hard to swallow. This 1.5 page segment here is kind of just a perfect encapsulation of the book. Obama is taking every side. So he says right here, I just hadn't been able to do what FDR had done quite well enough. So he's like, I should have done what FDR did. Then he's like, next paragraph, he says, Axe offered his own assessment of what had gone wrong, saying that in the rush to get things done, we neglected our promise to change Washington by sidelining special interests and increasing transparency and fiscal responsibility across the federal government. And so now he's like, okay, we didn't take on enough special interests. Then Obama's like, oh yeah, no, absolutely, this is not. He says, but was this right? I wasn't sure. Yes, we'd been hurt by the sausage making around the ACA, as in working with all the special interests on the bills didn't help the ACA a lot, and fairly or not, we'd been tarnished by the bank bailouts. Obviously unfairly, or he wouldn't have said that. And so he says, I was trying to do what FDR did, and then he says, okay, yes, I worked with all the special interests on my major pieces of reform. And then he goes on to say, I could point to the scores of good government's initiatives we had introduced, whether it was limiting the hiring of former lobbyists, Again, I just mentioned Eric Holder, Tim Geithner, Larry Summers, who are just the top kind of people related to finance and the prosecution of the banks. Okay, maybe they weren't registered lobbyists, but they worked for all these companies, and they come from a certain class of people that protects their interests all the time. So the problem isn't that type of kind of Trump-like corruption, deal, $100,000 in a duffel bag in order to overthrow the government. It's just the, kind of banal, ordinary corruption, which is all over the administration. And then one paragraph later, he takes the third side of the same issue, which these are not compatible sides. You can't believe this, and this are all true. You can't believe everything is the reason all at once. It's either you took on the special interests and that was a problem, or you didn't take them on and that was a problem, or you worked too much with Republicans and that was a problem, or you didn't work enough with them. But he's like, all of this, I did everything at once and I didn't get credit for any of it. And so that was the fault of this was the fault of it. He says, politically though, no one seemed to care about our work to clean up the government any more than they credited. So he's like, clean up the government any more than they credited us for having bent over backwards to solicit Republican ideas on every single one of our legislative issues. Okay, so he's like, I bent backwards to work with Republicans on every single legislative issue, and I had tried to be the next FDR, but wasn't quite cunning enough. Did FDR bend over backwards to work with Republicans on every issue, or did he beat them over the head with the fact that they had crashed the economy and that they were in the pockets of special interests, and that he was going to be on the side of workers and he's not going to compromise with the Lindsey Grahams of his era? No, so these are not compatible things. But Obama has to, he's just throwing mud at the wall and hoping that some of it sticks, and it does stick for most people. As to this is why he lost, but none of it can be his fault. The only fault that he'll ever accept is that he tried too hard to reform a corrupt system, not that he accommodated himself to it and didn't try at all. And so then a few pages later, Obama needs to put a bow on this segment of the book and thread the needle of explaining to us how the same population that had just elected him overwhelmingly 2 years prior on a platform of hope and change had just rebuked him overwhelmingly 700 short days later, without it being anything that was his fault at all. It has to be something with the existential nature of humanity and our inner desires and biology and hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and tribalism and religion and the natures of the cosmos and things just out of his control, the powers that he can't impact at all. He says, except now I found myself asking whether those impulses of violence, greed, corruption, nationalism, racism, and religious intolerance, the all too human desire to beat back our own uncertainty and morality and sense of insignificance by subordinating others, were too strong for any democracy to permanently contain. Maybe there's nothing we can do about it. For they seem to lie in wait everywhere, ready to resurface whenever growth rates stalled or demographics changed or a charismatic leader chose to ride a wave of people's fears and resentments. So Obama really doesn't like charismatic leaders riding a populist wave into power. And as much as I might have wished otherwise, there was no Mahatma Gandhi around to tell me what I might do to hold such impulses back. So Obama was looking for the Mahatma Gandhi of his era. Was it Tim Geithner? Was it Larry Summers? Was it Defense Secretary Robert Gates? Was it General Petraeus? They all didn't seem quite like Mahatma Gandhi, and these were the people I chose to run my administration.